Greetings, hello, and welcome to TMI Live 61, 1961. Last week during TMI Live number 60, I thought it would be fun, mainly because I couldn't think of anything else to do off the top, to look through our archive file for 1960. And that was kind of fun, so I thought we'd do the same thing. Sayrain Alfonso Williams is always first to join in. Thanks, man. It's good to see you. I thought it was fun to look at the file for 1960 last week, so why not look at 1961 this week? So that's what we're going to do tonight. Getting out here kind of late, so I didn't spend a lot of time reviewing it. The files are kind of... a lot of them are things copied from magazines, papers from archives, and just kind of thrown into the files, not really separated. So I've separated them here, and there's a few things. It's not everything he did in 1961, but a few things which are kind of fun. And again, one of the interesting things to looking at an author's work year by year is to see it all together like that. I don't know if other authors are like that, but there's certain overlaps that I was able to see just quickly glancing through. For example, here we have an article for the Canadian Architect, June 1961, called Inside the 5 Sense Sensorium. And it has a funny phrenology looking illustration at the top. And there are common themes. For example, here Marshall brings up Peter F. Drucker, management consultant. Marshall was a little bit trying to get into the business consulting game, as we'll see in a later article here. Peter Drucker was a big figure in business consulting in the 60s, management consulting. I'll start with, I'm just going to read a little bit of every article. Inside the 5 Sense Sensorium, Marshall McLuhan, Canadian Architect, June 1961. In his Landmarks of Tomorrow, Peter F. Drucker considers many of the new forms in modern production, management, and decision-making. For example, owing to the new ways of moving and coding information, it has become difficult to exercise delegated authority. Instead, there is a growing need for the authority of knowledge with attendant speed of decision. Staff and line procedures in management and production are increasingly abandoned for small team patterns. When several people of diversified competences can tackle problems together, jobs get done. He stresses that the assembly line is obsolete. Exactly synchronized information on electric tape makes one thing at a time unnecessarily slow and needlessly sequential. It's a constant theme of Marshall's work at this time, the move from typography, from print, from the mechanistic age into the electric age, so from sequence into simultaneity. So this is definitely right up his alley. He then brings up a guy named Bernard Bergson, etc., etc. And he's talking about television. Television is a big theme. He brings up J.C. Carruthers, which he brings up in Understanding Media. J.C. Carruthers, whose work is now considered very questionable, I think. And what else? Let's see how he ends it. It seems quite obvious that the lineality that invaded every kind of spatial organization from the 16th century onward had its archetype and matrix in the metal lines of Gutenberg's uniform and repeatable types. Today, when David Reisman in The Lonely Crowd writes of the decline of inner goals and inner direction, he testifies to the overlaying of lineal forms of reading experience by the new electric fields of multi-leveled global awareness. The book thrives as never before, but its form is no longer constitutive or dominant. This is the whole thrust of obsolescence, meaning not death but change, and the medium's message. Surely this is why architectural design is entrusted now with a major task of sustaining traditional values achieved by print culture. How to breathe new life into the lineal forms of the past 5 centuries while admitting the relevance of new organic forms of spatial organization, bracket what I've explained as auditory space above. Is not this the task of the architect at present? But what chance has he of tackling this task at all if he has no standing of the media forms which inform the architecture of recent centuries, or of the new media forms which inspire the Bauhaus fashions of the present? Is it not time that we began to think seriously about a consensus for our media, as we already try to think of some social relevance for structure and design in our buildings? If our massive new electric media are direct extensions of sight and sound and touch and kinesthesia, is there not urgent need to consider a possibility of a consensus or ratio and balance among these for our collective sanity? Even a slight disturbance of the balance among our private senses can drive us to wit's end. We live in a time when the whole people have gone out of their wits when impelled by new massive forms such as radio. Psychologists explain that when the field of attention has a center without a margin, we are hypnotized. Such is the condition of tribal man, past or present. The problem of design is to understand the media forces in such wise that we need never sink into the zombie tribal state where we can meet that Africa within which Conrad immortalized in his Heart of Darkness. Well, that's something. Next, we still have Marshall writing book reviews, and here he is in Renaissance again, a critical journal of letters, this time with 2 reviews, books on James Joyce and Finnegan's Wake. The first is Producers and Consumers, titled James Joyce by Richard Ellman, New York, Oxford University Press. New York is spelt with a Q here. $12.50, inexpensive book at the time. Marshall starts, "It is quite possible that this is the first book on Joyce since Professor Levin's that will prove seriously misleading to the young Joyce student. Levin's book was small and early. Professor Ellman's book is large and late. Both books are based on a deep misunderstanding of Joyce with regard to, quote, naturalism and, quote, symbolism. This very misunderstanding has also been the reason for their ready acceptance by the literary establishment, for it was the occasion of no small rejoicing on the part of the mandarins to hear that all Joyce was really up to was a continuation of already familiar patterns." So we know what Marshall thought of the book. I'll read the concluding statement as well, as I find that the first and the last statements are really the best here. There is one adage the young will discover in using this work, namely that Ellman's naive misconceptions are so accessible and startling that the young readers have the pleasure of flat disagreement with the senior teacher. It would also be misleading to conclude this notice without thanks to Ellman for this item, quote, "Do you believe in the Scienza Nuova?" asked Christensen. "I don't believe in any science," Joyce answered, "but my imagination grows when I read Vico, as it doesn't when I read Freud or Jung," end quote. Joyce found Freud and Jung naive and mechanical. Interesting to note Marshall's deliberate use of the term mechanical here. This is the same reason why McLuhan had a similar view. He didn't see a lot of use for people who are heavily mechanistic in the electric age. What does the one have to tell about the other? The second review here is titled "The Electric Culture," and it's a review of the Books at the Wake review, quote unquote, by James S. Atherton, Faber and Faber, 1959. Marshall begins, this is, quote, "a study of some literary allusions in James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake," end quote. The very nature of symbolism is the systematic withholding of information in order to get the reader into the act. Poe developed both symbolist poetry and the detective story on these lines. It is inevitable, therefore, that any symbolist structure will be elusive rather than declarative. Elusive as in illusion, not illusion, or elusive, allusive. The result has been that modern poetry has come to mean courses in world literature and culture, and scholarly comment on modern symbolist structures has taken the form of filling in what the author deliberately left for the reader to fill in for himself. It is a question, therefore, how valid is the task of writing and publishing what the original author assumed would be task of each reader for himself. I can't help but feel a little bit busted myself, because here I am starting another 12-week course on understanding media, filling in these gaps that Marshall expected the reader to fill in for themselves. But there you go. He finishes, "To some this may appear as a utopian picture or dream of the future, but it entails great suffering even now. Most of our acquired culture and established institutions will automatically be brainwashed from our private and collective lives during the process of the electric welding of society, much as medieval institutions were affected by the coming of the assembly lines of Gutenberg movable types. In the wake, Joyce assimilates the whole of our new electric culture to traditional book culture in a great paradigm verbivoco-visual culture." Verbivoco-visual would become the title of number 8 of the Explorations anthologies in the late 58, I think, 1958, maybe 1959. So 2 reviews there. Next we have this item, The Humanities in the Electronic Age. There's a note here. This is, okay, I'm confused because there are 2 copies of this in here, but I think they're both the same thing. They are. There's a note here. It says, "From a lecture given at the annual meeting of the Humanities Association of Canada held in Montreal, June 1961. And this is the Humanities Association Bulletin, Volume 12, Number 1, Fall 1961. Pardon me. Again, Marshall opens up with Peter Drucker. "It was Peter Drucker, former professor of philosophy and now dean of the School of Management of New York University, who set in effect at the outset of his Landmarks of Tomorrow," quote, 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 quote. Actually, this is a very large quote. I wanted to pull actually a piece that caught my eye a little further inside. "That ever new models of the artist are for the correction, the ever new models of the artist are for the correction of the perceptual bias inflicted upon any human community by ever new technology. In the past century, indeed, we have come to rely almost wholly on art for the nutrition of fresh impulse and the alerting of hypnotized senses. No previous society ever regarded art this way, but no previous society ever underwent the successive brainwashings and hypnotic trances that ours has done from a succession of new technologies." Marshall brings up Bertrand Russell. Then he brings up Innes, and this is interesting. "Now to come to the Bertrand Russell point, that the great discovery of the 20th century concerns the technique of the suspended judgment. The technique of insight itself is a natural phase to succeed the 19th century discovery of the technique of invention, because it is the means of abstracting oneself from the bias and consequence of one's own culture. If a merely negative criterion were needed, it would be easy to infer from the dismay and incomprehension which the later work of Harold Innes has caused in the minds of his admirers that he had finally hit upon a discovery of a very considerable and a very exacting nature. Innes's concern in the bias of communication and later is with the technique of the suspended judgment, That means not the willingness to admit other points of view, but the technique of how not to have a point of view. This is identical with the problem facing physicists in correcting the bias of the instruments of research, and it draws attention to the fact that the historian, the poet, the critic, and the philosopher now as always face exactly the same situations as the scientist. Very interesting. And a neat article. We can't obviously read the entire thing, so I'll read the concluding paragraph here. Yet today as never before, the task of the humanities is to keep clear and lively the modes of discourse and the forms of mental life. More than ever before, humanists are called on to understand many new languages born of the new forms of new knowledge, nor will these new languages obviate the older ones. Jet travel and satellite broadcasting will foster the grasp of languages, ancient and modern, and a simultaneous cultural transparency. The concept of history of the philosopher Heidegger recommends itself as a natural model for the humanities in the electric age. It is the idea of the poetic of history as a kind of unified language, the inner key to the creation of which can be grasped by a deepening sense of the spiritual energy encompassed in the ceaselessly growing life of words. That's nice. The ideal marriage of Mercury and philology, of spiritual values and perfected method, will be consummated, if ever, in the electronic age. The guy did have a nice turn of phrase when he was writing. What next? Oh yeah. This is an interesting one. This was published in the Basilian Teacher, 95 St. Joseph Street, Toronto, Canada. So this was at St. Michael's College, University of Toronto, Volume 6, Number 3, December 1961. 95 St. Joseph. Marshall's office at the University of Toronto before the Centre for Culture and Technology was at 96 St. Joseph. I believe that building is no longer there. This article is called The New Media and the New Education, H. Marshall McLuhan, December 1961. The artist, I'm going to read a little bit. I'm going to read the first page of this because it's kind of gold. The artist, wrote Wyndham Lewis, is engaged in writing a detailed history of the future because he is aware of the unused possibilities of the present. It is quite literally true that since printing, it has been the poets and painters who have explored and predicted the various possibilities of print, of prints, of telegraph, of press, of photograph, movie, radio, and television. In recent decades, the arrival of several new media has led to prodigious experimentation in the arts. But at present, the artists have yielded to the media themselves. Experimentation has passed from the control of the private artist to the groups in charge of the new technologies. That is to say that whereas in the past the individual artist, manipulating private and inexpensive materials, was able to shape models of new experience years ahead of the public, today the artist works with expensive public technology, and artist and public merge in a single experience. The new media need the best artistic talent and can pay for it. But the artist can no longer provide years of advanced awareness of developments in the patterns of human experience, which will inevitably emerge from the new technological development. Interesting. He goes on, the painters of the 15th century explained perspective or fixed point of view to the public when print was scarcely known. Aretino became, quote, the scourge of princes when print was young, and long before the newspaper took up its inevitable republican role. Petrarch developed the sonnet as a mode of self-expression and of self-analysis before print, and long before Montaigne revealed the artistic meanings of the printed page in his essays. In a word, the artist discerns the forms of technological change in their full cultural dimensions before the technicians actually take over. But today, for the first time in human history, our technology includes an external projection of each of our senses. nobody has considered the significance of this development, which confers on our technology an inclusive organic relation to mankind for the first time. And so on. This is a really cool article, several pages. It concludes, the new criticism, or reading in depth, which has appeared in our electronic era is often called scholastic in form by literary humanists. Is it not terribly wasteful of values and opportunities, as well as destructive of harmony, that unwittingly men should so embroil themselves in civil feuds arising from media change? In our age, the onset of multiple media changes makes impossible the older patterns of gradual adjustment and oblivion of the obsolete. There is no time to adjust. We simply have to know and understand exactly what is happening, and indeed, as educators, we can avail ourselves of the artists to help us become contemporaries of ourselves. Rather, we must all become creative artists in order to cope with even the banalities of daily life. We're almost at the end. This is a little bit funny. This is a thick typescript. It's some 30 pages or so of type. And there's a note on the cover of it, which I think refers, it's hard to know because this just says, Kevin Cole says the name, what is the name of that article? The name of the article is The New Media in the New Education. It was published, Volume 6, Number 1 of the Bazillion Teacher, December 1961. I'm not sure. Kevin, I'll make a note to check and see if there's a copy of it somewhere, and I'll let you know, okay? Because, yeah, that's a really cool article. And you know what? I'm going to go ahead and make a note, or I will forget. Kevin Cole. I'm getting old. I need to make notes, or I won't remember things. Yeah, so this is kind of funny. It's a typescript, and there's this cover note. You're very welcome, Kevin. There's a cover note here on Encounter letterhead. Encounter magazine, London, 18th December 1961. Dear Mr. McLuhan, Mr. Spender has asked me to write and thank you for sending your manuscript accompanied by a letter to Mr. Criscoll dated June 13th. He has read your article with much interest, but feels that it is not quite suitable for publication in Encounter. Mr. Spender has mentioned as a possible title, quote, The Image in Television, or something of that nature, but comments that your article in its present state seems a little disjointed and reads rather like random notes for 6 articles than 1. In Mr. Spender's absence, I am passing these comments on to you. I hope they are of some help. Yours sincerely, Sally McKinnon, Secretary. So yeah, apparently is a little much. This starts, and this is kind of interesting. A recent issue of Life magazine featured, quote, a marriage that began underwater and has not gone on the rocks, unquote. The couple, married underwater 7 years ago, are again shown underwater with their children beside the anniversary cake. Obviously, American fantasy and expressionism have not declined. But 10 years of television have altered much in the American image. My book, The Mechanical Bride, Folklore of Industrial Man, appeared in 1951 in the first year of American network television. Its theme is now obsolete. What I hope to explain here in a few pages is how and why television has in many respects ended attitudes of easy acceptance of the mechanical and industrial modes of life in North America. And he goes on for many, 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 many pages. Ending with, print has conferred the forms of segmental dissociation and homogeneous calculus upon all human endeavors of years. We had only to tackle one thing at a time in order to conquer any problem. By skepticism, we could move mountains. The electromagnetic discovery ended that phase and the relevance of that method. We now have to know and do everything at once. It is not strange that there should be rising in America the matrix of change, a new passion for permanence in continuity. And there you have it. The last bit here, there's two more. This is a typescript, a TSS of about 10 pages, just over 10 pages, titled Canadian Poetry. Again, it's good to remind ourselves that Marshall McLuhan was a professor of poetry and literature for his entire career. He was an expert in modernist poetry, very well known at this time, especially in academia for that. This begins, like Canadian painting, Canadian poetry shows three very easily discerned areas. In painting, there is the constable phase of landscape and perspective from 1800 till 1920. Then came the group of seven, which ended perspective and turned to the presentation of external process in nature and urban life. Finally, after the Second War in 1946, the International School appeared, and readiness to accept a variety of modes and motifs and inner processes as well as outer. In poetry, from colonial beginnings until 1920, Canadian poets accepted the fate of outer landscape as the formula for inner states of mind, if only because this pattern had been worked out by the Romantics on the basis of Newton's optics. But Canadian landscapes, if used as equations for inner mental states, would yield some quite amazing results. Canadians could never bring themselves to accept the logic of their landscape in the way that Roy Campbell did with the landscapes of South Africa. Roy Campbell was a friend of the McLuhans. Had Canadians been daring enough to accept their landscape as the formula for mental states, in the way that Wordsworth or Byron did with theirs, they would have been projected into non-human orbits at once. And he goes on. This would seem a most, he quotes Wilfred Watson, for example, matches his in admiration for Dylan Thomas with a contempt for Dylan Thomas. Quote, "Poor Tourly good Thomas, his image is askew, when men were making things of men would hint, being afraid no heaven can be true, that thinghood is the heaven of the saint." This would seem a most auspicious point at which to conclude a note on Canadian poetry. The emergence of a dialogue among the poets speaks of an entry into the world of the English language which is quite new. The long reign of the picturesque landscape may be over. Marshall McLuhan. Lastly here, this is titled Paper for American Marketing Association Seminar, January 6, 1961. It's long, but there's this is kind of interesting. He starts off quoting Fortune magazine. He says, "I'm going to list some of the things that Marion Harper, does not know about the business he professes and about the problems he confronts. It may seem strange that a professor of the humanities should take the trouble to do the homework of a top executive. The reason is simple. Modern advertising and packaging invaded the sphere of the humanities long ago. It is time that the counter-invasion of marketing by the humanities got underway. It may seem strange that Marion Harper should, at the top of his business career, be entertaining the idea of a political or educational shift in career, but this is quite understandable today. Marketing is, and always has been, at once political, cultural, and education in scope and operation. Advertising has, at least since the discovery of the process of photo engraving, been a major sector of the entertainment industry as well. And poor of mind and spirit would be that man who could spend a lifetime in the 20th century without careful and judicial scrutiny of our world of industrialized entertainment and politics, which includes advertising." Here he says something. AT&T, by far the largest single industry in the world, moves only one commodity, information. Many times larger than motor cars and solid consumer goods in the electronic age is the commodity of information itself. Why should this be? The answer is the first item on my list of basic matters unknown to Marion Harper. It is this: we have driven our senses out of ourselves. Marshall got onto this thing. There was a book called The Law of the Situation by Mary Parker Follett, I believe her name was. And she, I believe, started this thing where she went into businesses and told them they didn't know what they were really actually in the business of doing, and went ahead and told them what they were actually doing. Marshall basically appropriated this technique and used it himself, going into business like AT&T and saying that, you actually don't make business machines, you're in the business of moving information and things like that. And companies and corporations paid him a lot of money to tell him that for a while there. He goes on, so this is an address to the American Marketing Association, and it was speeches like this which got him into that new career. Let's see how he ends it up. Let's see. I rejoice to concur. Now here is an area in which Marion Harper... Okay, back up a little bit more. We have passed out of the mechanical age into the electrical age. Again, with the electric movement of information, even our externalized senses begin to demand interaction, unity, and wholeness. Now here is an area in which Marion Harper has begun to achieve a sense of stress and urgency. I rejoice to concur with him in this awareness and hope that very many able men like him may move forward through a more adequate understanding and use of media to establish an interplay of centers and margins which, more than ever, will make marketing a major factor in establishing new and enduring values for the human family. Now that marketing has large access to all the highest human knowledge of technology in this greatest of human ages, its immediate opportunity and need is to find a unifying vision of its role in closest relation to education and to science. For the power of knowledge confers also the responsibility, the dignity, and joy of knowledge, uniting men in true community. There you have it, a little survey of Marshall McLuhan's writings and speaking in 1961. I hope that's been interesting. Good night, everybody. See you next week.